One of the challenges of doing data analysis in Power BI or any other program is just getting the data into a format that the program can read and analyze. And much of the high quality data you get is actually not yet in a format that these kinds of programs can read. So this example, this is a file of US coffee imports by country over the course of the last 20 years or so. And this comes from the US Department of Agriculture. So this is a very high quality source that would be a great example for you to use in data analysis. However, if we were to try and just analyze this in Power BI right now as is, we would run into some trouble. And so in this video, I'm going to go through an example of how we might clean this data, and specifically how you might do that on a Mac, because we have to use a few different programs and kind of hodgepodge them together instead of doing it all in Power BI Desktop, because Power BI Desktop does not run on a Mac. And so I'm going to go through kind of a roundabout way here of cleaning this up through Excel and Power Query. So the first thing I'm going to do here is just make a copy of this table so that we can return to the original source data. And then I'm going to do some quick renaming of things to kind of speed up the example I'm trying to make here. So I'm going to paste all these as values because it was originally a pivot table. And then I'm going to make sure all of our columns have headings. And then I'm just going to delete some of these extra rows and go ahead and save that. And then if I were to just try and drop this into Power BI right now, I'm going to go ahead and make a new report, import from Excel, and then I'm going to upload that file. You'll see that it identifies the different sheets, and then it tries to identify different tables in there. So I'm just going to go ahead and click the workbook that I was working in. So right off the bat, you'll see that even though I gave these columns headers, Power BI doesn't recognize that that first row of data is the column headers. And so we get this really messy column 1, column 2, column 3. Sometimes it can try and recognize them if it's already formatted as a table, which is helpful, but it still doesn't help us in this case. So really quick, I'm going to show you how to do that. Just how to turn this into a table. So you first want to make sure that you're selecting only your data. And then if I format that as a table, you get this check mark that says my table has headers. I'm going to hit OK. And then you can see it gives us a table name. So I'm just going to name this coffee table. So let's try importing that again. And you'll see that it now recognizes that table. And now it sees our column headers, which is really helpful. So I'm going to go ahead and create a report out of this. And then I just want to see how the volume of imports has changed over the years, which is something that we can see kind of pretty easily looking at the Excel sheet. I mean, we can tell that this should be a line chart showing how that value changes from year to year. But if we try and create that chart in Power BI, you'll see that we run into some issues here. So I'm going to first select the type of chart I want, and then I'm going to expand my data. And you'll see that there's really no easy way for me to map these years to the x-axis and then to put the values on the y-axis. If I were to try and, put these here, I could put each one there and then try to put like the unit on the y-axis, but it doesn't do the thing that we intuitively think it's going to do. And that's because this data isn't in a tidy format. So here is how we would clean this up and put it in a format that Power BI can actually read. If you are on a PC, you can do most of this from within Power BI Desktop. I'm going to go through it from Excel because that is how you might have to do it if you were on a Mac. So first, I'm going to switch over to our clean sheet, so the original download here. And we are first going to select all of our data. And I am working on a PC right now, so if you're on a Mac, this will look slightly different. But I'll go through the steps so that you can see exactly what you'll need to do. And then I'm going to switch over into the Data tab. And what we want to do is pull this information into kind of a separate Microsoft program called Power Query, which is also built off of Excel. You can get to it from Excel. So if we go into Get Data, if you're on a PC, you can do this from Table Range, but on a Mac, that's not there. So we're going to go to Get Data, and then from Excel Workbook. And then I would have to navigate to this file. And it launches the Power Query Navigator. And this sheet is the one we're on currently. So this is the data that I'm going to try and load in. And you can see this looks really similar to the screen on Power BI. Instead of just loading it, we are going to transform this data because we need to clean this up a little bit. So now this launches the Power Query Editor, and it looks similar to Excel, but this is a workspace just for cleaning up data. The first thing we should do is give our columns some names and kind of delete some of these extra empty rows that we have. And everything in the Power Query Editor is done as a step that's applied to the entire workbook. So I can't say just select this row and delete this row. If I want to delete all these extra rows down here below my actual data, I will have to go to Remove Rows, Remove Bottom Rows, and then it'll make me give it a number. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I'm going to remove the bottom 5 rows. And once I do that, you see that it adds a step over here to the applied steps. And we can jump back through our changes just by going through those different applied steps. So I'm going to do the same thing up top here. I'm going to delete the first 3 rows, or I'm sorry, first 2 rows, which are kind of empty. And then I want to use my first row as headers so that we can get these years up into our column names. So you'll see that it kind of used that first row to plug in the values at the top here, but we do still need to rename some of these. So if I double click up there, I can change this to source is what this was. This column 2 is an extra column we don't need, so I'm actually going to remove this column. I'm going to rename column 3 to country, column 4 to unit, and this is starting to get into a cleaner format, kind of like the table we had. The other thing we need to do is we still have all these null values, and that is a problem for us. So we can delete these empty rows by going to remove rows again and then remove blank rows, and watch what happens to this row 11 and 21 where we have all those null values. It can see those and it can pull them out. And then we also want to fill in the rest of these source rows so that each row is an observation and it has a source tied to it. So if I go to transform, there's an option for filling, and then fill down will take whatever the value is and copy it down to the rows below it. Fill up will do the opposite, but we want fill down here. So you'll see that that makes sure that we have a source for every row. And then the big thing here that we need to do is we need to create a year column so that we can map that year to the x-axis. This process is going to convert our table from what is sometimes called a wide format to a tall format. We need to unpivot these columns. So I'm going to select the first year here. I'm going to scroll to the end, and while holding Shift, I'm going to click on the end here so that I have just my year columns selected. And then while I'm still in the Transform tab, I'm going to unpivot columns, unpivot only the selected columns. In the first few times you do this, this is going to feel kind of confusing. It's hard to wrap your brain around what's happening here. But the more you do it, the more you'll kind of get an eye for intuitively the way this data needs to be structured and what's happening once you unpivot these wide columns like this. So if I unpivot the selected columns, you'll see that before, Brazil was one row, and then there was a column for each year that we measured Brazil. After we unpivoted those columns, Brazil turns into 20 something rows, and each year has its own row, its own observation. So the value becomes a column, which it wasn't before. Value is tied in with the year. And the year becomes a column, which we need to rename. So this is actually a much easier format for something like Power BI to analyze. But before we do that, I'm just going to do a few other things to tidy this up, just to show you what all you can do in Power Query, which is really helpful. So year right now is a string. We can see that by selecting the data type here. We can actually turn this into a date so that it knows that this is a measurement of time. And then it filled these out as all being January 1st. That's not exactly what this is. And so then I'm also going to go to date over here, and I can change this to just the year. And you'll see that tidies that up a little bit. Okay, this is looking pretty good to me. So I'm going to go ahead and File, Close and Load. That will add that table we made into a new sheet. And so I'm just going to quickly rename this table Coffee Tidy. I'm going to do the same to my sheet, just so we can keep track of things. I'm going to Control or Command S that to save it. And now let's see what happens when we try and load that into Power BI. So here is my table. You'll see this looks just like we saw it in Power Query. And now if I try to make that line chart, it becomes much more intuitive. So here, now I can just add the year to the x-axis. I don't have all those years in different columns. And then the value can be on the y-axis. And we very quickly get a line chart that we were expecting to at the start. So that's just an example of how you might go about tidying up your data and putting it into a format that is easy to analyze in a program like Power BI.